When you hear about ancient religious texts, specifically Surah An-Nisa from the Quran, what actually comes to mind?
Right. Usually it's a very specific set of rules.
Exactly. I mean, if you're familiar with the traditional interpretations, you're probably thinking of a list of domestic rules, regulations about marriage, divorce, maybe some guidelines on inheritance for widows and orphans.
Yeah, a very localized 7th century household manual, basically.
Right. But what if we told you that we're looking at a text that might actually be the blueprint for a state-run social security system?
Which is just a staggering thought.
It really is, like a macroeconomic constitution designed to ensure that literally no human being on Earth is left without sustenance.
It's a massive paradigm shift. You go from looking at a set of localized family regulations to, uncovering a universal manifesto for human rights and socioeconomic equity. It completely changes the scale of what the text is actually trying to achieve.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, you are joining us on a journey into the works of Allama G.A. Parwez, specifically his socioeconomic and scientific analysis of Surah An-Nisa, verse 1.
Yeah, and we have a really fascinating stack of sources in front of us today.
We do. We've got translated lectures, detailed notes, fact sheets, and specific excerpts that completely reframe this ancient scripture as like a modern constitutional charter.
But before we jump into the deep end here, it's crucial to establish some ground rules for our discussion today.
But absolutely.
Because the sources we are exploring delve deeply into theology, politics, and statecraft. I want to be entirely clear with you, the listener. We are looking at these texts objectively.
Right, we're acting as reporters here.
Exactly. We are not taking sides politically or religiously, nor were we endorsing these viewpoints. Our goal is simply to unpack the fascinating ideas, the linguistic arguments, and the socioeconomic frameworks contained in the original source material so you can understand them fully.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp what Parwez is arguing, we have to look at how these verses have historically been treated.
Right, which is mostly as rituals.
Yeah. For centuries, people have treated these specific verses as almost like ritual blessings. You recite them at a wedding, or you read them as a literal historical recounting of Adam and Eve in a magical garden.
Yes, the traditional Genesis narrative.
Right. But Parwez is looking at the exact same Arabic words and arguing something completely different. He says this is a deeply rational, highly technical manual for civilizational survival.
That is the core of his thesis. But there's a massive gap to bridge there.
A huge gap.
Right. I mean, how do we get from a religious verse traditionally recited at weddings to a mandate for universal health care and equitable resource distribution?
It sounds wild when you put it like that.
It does. But to understand the social policies he uncovers, we first have to completely rewrite our understanding of the biological origin story.
Wait, biology?
Yeah. We cannot look at the sociology until we look at what Parwez calls the linguistic key.
Oh, I want to spend some real time on this linguistic key because it is the foundation for, well, everything else we're going to talk about today.
It really is.
So Parwez focuses heavily on the concept of the real meaning or mafhum of Quranic vocabulary. Now, for hundreds of years, these words were translated through a very specific mythological lens.
Right, the prevailing cultural stories of the time.
Exactly. We all know the prevailing story. A deity molding a literal dry clay statue of a man, breathing into it, and then extracting a literal rib from that statue to make a woman.
Which, Parwez notes, is a narrative heavily borrowed from the Old Testament's book of Genesis.
Okay, so how did it get into the Quranic translations?
Well, during the early centuries of Quranic commentary, there was a significant influx of what are known as Israelot.
Israelot, right.
Yeah, these are traditions and myths from surrounding cultures, particularly Jewish and Christian folklore. As the Islamic Empire expanded and absorbed different cultures, these ancient mythologies began to color the translation of the Arabic vocabulary.
Oh, I see.
So Parwez argues that the pure original semantics of the Quranic Arabic were basically hijacked by these pre-existing myths.
So he's essentially stripping away centuries of Persian, Roman, and biblical folklore to get back to the raw Arabic root words.
Exactly.
And when he does that, he claims the text aligns not with a magical fable, but with pure evolutionary biology and biochemistry.
That is his argument. He executes a really profound semantic shift. I mean, he rescues the Quranic vocabulary from mythology
Yeah.
and grounds it in observable science.
Let's actually test that. Let's dig into the vocabulary he highlights because the transformation he suggests is just staggering.
It's a complete rewrite of the narrative.
Yeah. Let's start with the very basics of the creation narrative. The words teen and ma. Traditionally, teen was translated simply as clay. Like, Plato used to sculpt a human figure.
Right, but Parwez points out that scientifically and linguistically, teen actually designates completely lifeless inorganic matter.
Lifeless matter, not wet mud.
Exactly, not wet mud at all. It represents the foundational, non-living elements of the earth before any biological spark existed.
So we're talking about, what, basic elements?
Yeah, we were talking about basic carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. The raw, dry, inorganic dust of a primordial planet.
But dry dust it doesn't spontaneously turn into a living organism.
It cannot. Life could never spontaneously emerge from this dry, inorganic matter alone. It required an active catalyst to begin any sort of chemical reaction.
And that catalyst is ma.
Exactly. Ma, or water. The text explicitly states that every living thing was made from water. Parwez defines this not as a poetic metaphor, but as a pure scientific truth.
Because water is the universal biological solvent.
Right. It is the foundational catalyst required for the biochemical reactions that lead to life.
I hear what you're saying, but let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
If I go into my backyard right now and mix a hose with some dry dirt, I get mud. I don't get a biological life form.
Right, you just get a puddle.
Yeah. So how does this framework actually explain the leap from wet dirt to a living cell? The sources mention these specific Arabic terms, hami in maznoon and salsal.
This is where we have to look at the chemistry Parwez extracts from the text.
Yeah.
When that lifeless, inorganic clay teen mixes with water, it doesn't just instantly become a human.
Which would be magic.
Right. The text says it is exposed to solar heat over immense periods, which triggers a very specific chemical process. It ferments.
Wait, ferments.
Yes. That fermentation is the definition of hami and maznoon.
Fermentation, like how you brew beer or make kombucha?
Similar chemical principles, yeah. Hami maznoon translates to black, altered, or fermented mud. It implies a process of chemical alteration over time.
Oh, wow.
It produces a distinct rotting odor, creating a highly fertile, nutrient-rich environment. A primordial soup, essentially.
Okay, so the soup is brewing.
Exactly. And it is in this specific fermented biochemical environment that the very first microscopic microbial cells can emerge.
So it's describing the exact conditions that modern science dictates are necessary for abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living matter.
And Parwez argues the text provides a control group to prove this exact scientific point.
A control group in an ancient text.
Yes. It introduces the terms salsal or fakar. These terms refer to dried, renin clay like baked pottery.
Okay, so clay without the water.
Right. Parwez explains the implication here. If the environmental elements are left dry, without that precise mixture of water and solar heat to induce fermentation, no life can occur.
It just sits there.
Exactly. The matter remains entirely lifeless. It just bakes in the sun and it rings when you tap it. Life requires that exact chemical fermentation of hama and maznoon.
Okay, so we have this fermented, smelly, nutrient-rich mud on a primordial earth. What actually comes out of it?
This is where the vocabulary gets really interesting.
Right. The text uses the term Nafsin Wahidah. Now, traditionally, almost every translation assumes Nafsin Wahidah means atom, a single, fully formed biological man walking right out of the mud.
Functionally and scientifically, Parwez translates Nafsin Wahidah completely differently. He defines it as the original life cell, the jarsuma.
The original life cell.
Yes.
Yes.
He argues it is the very first living, unicellular organism that birthed directly from that fermented mud. It is the singular unicellular origin of all earthly biology.
I'm going to push back heavily on that. Are you telling me a text from the Arabian desert 1400 years ago is talking about a single-celled microscopic organism, a zygote?
I know, it sounds like a stretch.
It does. How is that not just Parwez reading a modern biology textbook, looking back at the Quran and retrofitting the translation? How does he justify that linguistically?
It is a totally fair skepticism, and it is exactly the friction Parwez addresses. He defends this by looking strictly at the Arabic root of the word nafs.
Okay, what's the root?
Well, while later cultures adopted it to mean soul, or a person like Adam, the root of nafs simply denotes a breathing, living entity, an animate being.
And Wahidah.
Wahidah means singular, solitary, or foundational unit.
Singular animate unit.
Right. When you strip away the biblical folklore of a sculpted man, the literal translation is a singular animate unit. In the context of life emerging from fermented mud, the most scientifically accurate translation of a singular animate unit is a single life cell.
That is a massive leap, but I see the linguistic logic there.
It tracks with the root words.
But if we are throwing out the literal clay statue of Adam, we absolutely have to talk about Eve.
Right, the Zoj.
Yeah, the traditional translation, the one almost everyone has heard, says a wife, a zawj, was pulled from his rib. If Parwez is saying Adam is actually just a microscopic single cell in a primordial soup, where does a rib come from?
What's fascinating here is there is no rib in this framework.
No rib at all.
None. Historically, through the lens of that Genesis-style mythology, translators forced the word zawj to mean a literal wife extracted from a bone.
Right.
But biologically and linguistically, zawj doesn't strictly mean a human spouse. It denotes a counterpart, a pair, an interdependent pairing.
A pair, like a matching set of shoes.
More functionally, a biological complement. Parwez argues that in the context of this original life cell, the Nafsin Wahidah, the creation of its zawj refers to the splitting of that cell.
Wait, he is interpreting a 7th century word for pair as literal cellular mitosis.
Yes, he is arguing that the text is describing the exact moment the single cell splits into complementary sister cells or daughter cells to initiate biological reproduction.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and later in the evolutionary chain, this manifests as the spermatozoon and ovum. Neither half can multiply or function in isolation. They are entirely complementary.
So they need each other to exist.
Exactly. That division initiated the mechanics of all biological procreation. That is his true functional meaning of zawj.
I want the listener to just pause and imagine this for a second. Imagine you are holding a text. For hundreds of years, you, your parents, your ancestors have been reading it like a beautiful but scientifically vague bedtime story.
A fable, essentially.
Right. A fable about a man, a rib, and a magic garden. And then suddenly, you apply this linguistic key. You strip away the Roman and Persian and biblical myths, you look at the raw Arabic roots, and you realize you might be reading a textbook on evolutionary biology hidden in plain sight.
It's a completely different book at that point.
It is. Centuries before Charles Darwin ever set foot on the HMS Beagle, this framework argues the text maps out inorganic fermentation, the necessity of water as a biochemical catalyst, the emergence of a single animate unit, and cellular division to propel biodiversity.
It completely bridges the gap between ancient scripture and modern empirical science. It attempts to turn the text from a book of abstract, magical charms into a concrete, scientifically grounded record of our origins.
But it raises another massive question for me.
What's that?
Let's say we accept this premise. Let's say life started as a single fermented cell, a Nafsin Wahidah, and it underwent cellular division, zawj. How in the world did we get from a microscopic amoeba dividing in a puddle to complex, thinking humans sitting in a studio recording a deep dive?
Right, it's a long journey.
Yeah, we didn't just jump from a single cell to a guy in a suit.
We certainly didn't. And Parwez argues the text explicitly denies that we did. This brings us to a crucial concept in his framework at Wara, which outlines the epic, grueling timeline of evolution.
Let's get into it, Wara, because this timeline completely shatters the instant creation myth. You know, the idea that the universe and humans were just poofed into existence in 6 literal 24-hour days.
Traditionally, Awara was often understood vaguely as abstract states of being or mysterious phases.
Very metaphorical.
Right. But Parwez redefines it based on the linguistic root and the scientific context we've established. Awara refers to distinct measurable evolutionary stages, phases, or periods. And we're not talking about days or weeks. We were talking about periods spanning tens of thousands to millions of years.
So it's a marathon, not a magic trick.
Exactly.
How does the text describe the actual mechanics of this progression? Because evolution is messy. It's full of dead ends and mutations.
The text uses 2 very specific terms to describe the rhythm of this evolution. Mustada and mustakar.
Mustada and mustakar.
Right. Life doesn't just leap instantaneously and chaotically from one stage to the next. It remains in a state of temporary resting or settlement. That is, mustakar.
Like an incubation period.
Precisely. During a specific evolutionary stage, a species will remain in mustakar for millions of years. It establishes itself in its environment, adapts, stabilizes its genetics, and thrives.
Okay, and then what?
Then, when the biological time is right, it is entrusted mustada to the next higher biological stage.
It's like a cosmic relay race.
That's a great way to put it.
The baton of life rests with one species, stabilizes, and then is handed off to the next, slightly more complex iteration. And the sources we have actually list the specific stages outlined in the text, which is fascinating because they mirror modern paleontology almost perfectly.
Let's walk through those stages as Parwez categorizes them. First, as we discussed, we have inorganic fermentation. The water, the lifeless clay, the solar heat creating the primordial soup.
Right. And second, cellular division, the zouge, the splitting of that first cell to create biological reproduction.
Third is aquatic life. The evolutionary caravan advances first in the water. The text indicates that life began in the oceans, manifesting as fish and early marine life.
Which is exactly what the scientific consensus dictates.
Yes.
Then we hit the fourth stage, terrestrial adaptation. The waters recede, or life forms are thrust onto the muddy shores, and they have to adapt to breathe air and move on dry land. We get amphibians, crawling creatures, and early reptiles.
Fifth is mammalian procreation. This is a massive evolutionary leap, moving from laying eggs in the mud to internal gestation and nursing offspring with milk.
It's a huge shift in energy.
It requires a completely new level of biological complexity and maternal investment.
And finally, the sixth stage, the physical human form. After millions of years of Atwara, passing through the stages of Mustakar and Mustauda, we finally arrive at the structural, anatomical form of the human being.
But this is where Parwez introduces the most critical philosophical turn in his entire framework.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the arrival of the physical human form is not the end of the evolutionary journey. It's not the finish line.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You would think getting to the bipedal human body is the grand finale, the pinnacle of creation. But the text argues the exact opposite. Biology was just the preamble.
To understand this transition, we have to look at what separates that physical human form from the mammalian stage that preceded it. We have to contrast the concept of jibiat with ikhtiar wa irada.
I need you to break those terms down because this is where the biology turns into psychology. What is jibiat?
Jibiat is animal instinct. It is the automated biological programming that governs all other life forms on Earth.
So like hardwired behavior.
Exactly. Animals are pre-programmed by their genetics. A lion's cub automatically grows up to act as a lion. It will hunt. It will form a pride. It will roar. A goat's kid automatically behaves as a goat. It will graze. It will herd. It will flee from predators.
Right. A lion doesn't need to go to a university to learn how to be a lion.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't need moral instruction to fulfill its biological destiny. Its survival code, its operating system, basically comes pre-installed in its DNA.
Yes, they are entirely governed by Jibilat, but humans are different. The framework Parwez uncovers argues that the arrival of the human form marks the exact moment when purely automatic biological progression ends.
Okay, so what takes over?
Humans are endowed with something new, which Parwez translates as divine energy or Ruh Kadawandi.
Wait, Ruh Kadawandi, that is usually translated in the traditional myths as God literally blowing his own breath or spirit into the nostrils of the clay statue of Adam, right?
In the traditional mythological interpretation, yes. But functionally, and within this scientific framework, Parwez defines this divine energy as ikhtiar wa irada, conscious, free will and volition.
Free will.
Yes. Humans are injected with this unique cognitive energy, which effectively severs our reliance on automated animal instinct. We are no longer driven merely by biological automation. We have the burden of conscious choice.
But if you think about that, that sounds like a massive vulnerability.
This raises an important question, doesn't it?
It really does. If humans aren't guided by instinct like every other animal, what on earth guides them? If we lose the automated safety net of Jibilat, aren't we just completely exposed?
It is the ultimate evolutionary vulnerability.
Right.
Because we possess free will instead of programmed instincts, human babies are born as a blank slate.
A blank slate.
Right. An animal parent only needs to provide food and basic protection until the offspring can digest it independently, and then the biological relationship is basically over. The instinct takes over. But a human child is born fundamentally ignorant and unformed in its consciousness.
That is such a profound point. Think about it. Even if both parents are literal geniuses, let's say they're both Nobel laureates in physics, their baby is born completely ignorant.
Completely. It doesn't inherit their knowledge biologically.
If you leave a goat alone in a field, it figures out how to be a goat. If you leave a human baby alone in the woods, it doesn't automatically know how to build a fire or read a book or be a moral person.
It doesn't. If a society treats a human child like an animal, meaning providing only physical food and shelter while ignoring their intellectual, psychological, and moral training, that child will merely grow into an animalistic entity.
They won't truly be human.
Exactly. They will mimic the biological form of a human, but they will be devoid of true humanity. They will lack the civilized execution of free will.
Let me give you an analogy to see if I am tracking this. It's like we were talking about computer hardware versus software.
Okay, I like this.
A goat is like a basic calculator. It comes out of the box, you turn it on, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. A human being is like a state-of-the-art supercomputer, but it ships with a blank hard drive.
Right. No operating system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you don't install an operating system, if you don't give it data, structure, and programming, it's just a useless, heavy box. And if you try to install the goat's operating system onto the supercomputer, it's going to crash.
That is an excellent analogy. The human supercomputer requires an immensely complex operating system to function properly.
Right.
Because it has to manage the volatile energy of free will.
This is the narrative transition that completely blew my mind when I was reading these sources. If we aren't pre-programmed to survive like animals, then our survival depends entirely on how we treat each other. Biology has just mandated sociology.
It's unavoidable.
The fact that we are born as a blank slate, devoid of instinct, means we literally need a system.
And that required system is what Parwez identifies as the constitutional charter, or Nizami Wubiyat. This is where the biological theory becomes hardcore socioeconomic policy.
So let's transition from the primordial mud to human civilization. We have this blank slate vulnerability. A human child needs immense structured education, which the text calls talim, and they need developmental training, which is tarbiyat.
Right. Talim and tarbiyat.
You can't just feed a child and throw it into the woods. It devolves into a feral animal. So who is responsible for this talim and tarbiyat?
To bear the immense, decades-long burden of developing a child's free will, humans cannot live in isolation. They must establish foundational socioeconomic units. The most basic of these is what the text calls Al-Arham.
Al-Arham. Now, traditionally, if you look in an Arabic dictionary, that just means wombs, right? Or blood relatives.
Literally, yes.
Yeah.
But functionally within this macroeconomic framework, it represents the family unit as an institution. The rearing of a human child necessitates a structured, cooperative, and highly engaged family environment.
But it doesn't stop there.
No. Parwez argues the text doesn't stop at the family door. It scales this concept up to the entirety of society. It states that we must fundamentally redefine the concept of Nisa.
And Nisa is the title of the surah we are discussing. Surah An-Nisa, the women.
Yes, but Parwez argues we must move Nisa from just meaning a specific biological gender to representing a functional socioeconomic class.
Class.
Yeah, the vulnerable groups that require societal protection.
So An-Nisa isn't just a chapter about women, it's a chapter about the vulnerable. It's about widows, orphans, the disabled, the elderly, those left alone in the struggle of life who need the collective society to step up.
Exactly. When the text speaks of orphans, it isn't just talking about children who lost their parents. It is talking about anyone who is left without support. And that brings us to an incredibly powerful concept in the text, tas'alun.
Break down tas'alun for us.
Tas'alun is derived from the Arabic root for asking or questioning. But in this socioeconomic framework, Parwez translates it functionally as mutual dependence.
Mutual dependence.
Yes, it defines a civilized society where individuals are structurally, legally, and biologically interdependent.
It's not just a polite request, like, hey neighbor, can I borrow a cup of sugar? It's a structural reality that we fundamentally need and have the right to demand each other's help to survive.
Right, because of that blank slate.
Because we don't have animal instincts, we have to rely on the collective knowledge, resources, and support of the community.
Yes, but here is where we must address a counter-argument. If you look at nature, if you look at the animal kingdom governed by Jibilit survival, is often based on competition. The strong eat the weak.
Social Darwinism.
Exactly. Social Darwinism would argue that human society should function the same way. The fittest survive, the weak perish, and that strengthens the genetic pool of the species. Why does Parwez argue the Quran rejects this?
That is the million-dollar question. If evolution got us here, couldn't evolution also justify survival of the fittest? Why do we need a welfare state? Why can't the strong just hoard the resources?
Because of the linguistic key we established at the very beginning.
Yeah.
This is where Parwez introduces the ultimate economic engine of the text, encapsulated in the tree metaphor, to explain rububiyya, universal sustenance.
I want you, the listener, to really picture this metaphor, because it makes the economics of this ancient text incredibly clear. Imagine humanity as a massive, deeply rooted tree.
A single tree.
Right. The text established earlier that every single human being sprouted from one single life cell, the Nafsin Wahidah, that fermented origin in the primordial mud. We don't have different origins. We all share the exact same singular biological root.
Just as a healthy tree draws water and nourishment from its singular root and must distribute it equally so that every single branch, twig, and leaf flourishes, a functional human state must ensure equitable resource distribution. This is the definition of Rubiga.
And think about what happens to a literal tree if it doesn't do that. If the vascular system of the tree allows certain branches to hoard all the water and all the nutrients, those specific branches get huge, heavy, and dense.
They look strong.
But what happens to the rest of the branches? They dry up, they wither, and they snap off. The entire tree becomes lopsided, unbalanced, and ultimately sick.
And this is why Parwez argues the text's injunctions are incredibly strict. It fundamentally criminalizes the concentration of wealth.
Criminalizes it.
Yes. The intricate wealth distribution and inheritance laws detailed in Surah An-Nisa are historically viewed as mundane family court matters. Who gets the house, who gets the camel. But Parwez argues they are macroeconomic firewalls designed to prevent resource hoarding.
So if the socioeconomic system allows some people to hoard nutrients, to become billionaires while others in the same society starve or can't afford basic health care, the entire tree, the collective society, is held criminally responsible for that exploitation.
It's a collective failure.
It's not just, oh, that branch over there in the bad neighborhood is having a tough time. It is the root system of our civilization is failing.
This is Parwez's blueprint for the universal welfare state. Translated into modern governance, the biological interconnectedness of the Nafsin Wahidah, combined with the mandate of tasalun, mutual dependence, serves as the divine foundational argument for universal health care, social security, and equitable resource management.
I want to make this super relevant to you listening right now. Think about your own taxes. Think about the debates in your country over healthcare systems or funding for local public schools.
It's a constant debate.
It is. But this text, according to Parwez, is arguing that universal welfare isn't some modern progressive political luxury. It's not a debate about tax brackets or partisan politics. It is a biological imperative for human survival.
It's hardwired into us.
If you don't take care of the vulnerable, if you don't properly educate the blank slate children of your society, you are fundamentally violating the physics of human evolution. You are criminally exploiting the tree of humanity.
It proves that the Quran, in Parvez's view, is meant to be a highly technical manual dictating the construction of a unified, scientifically grounded socioeconomic order. It mandates that a central authority is legally obligated to institutionalize cooperation, ensuring that the basic survival needs of all vulnerable individuals are universally met.
But let's look at the real world. What happens if a society just ignores this?
Which happens often.
Yeah. What if a culture embraces hyper-individualism? What if they say, I earned my wealth, I got mine, survival of the fittest, good luck to the rest of the branches?
Then they trigger the social physics of the text. They invoke what Parwez calls the law of requital.
Social physics. I am fascinated by this framing because traditionally, if you disobey a religious text, the threat is just that God will be angry with you and punish you in an afterlife.
The spiritual consequence.
Right. But Parwez is saying something much more immediate and structural. It's literally physics.
Precisely. Or rather, I should say, it is a matter of strict causality. Just as physical laws govern chemical fermentation, meaning you cannot get life unless you have the exact right mix of water, inorganic clay, and solar heat, social laws govern human civilization.
It's cause and effect.
There is a severe, inescapable cause and effect relationship here.
Walk us through the mechanics of that cause and effect, because we evolved over millions of years through those at-war stages. Is Parwez saying that evolution can actually go backward?
Yes, because human evolution is now driven by ikhtiyar, irada, free will, and conscious choice. It is not guaranteed to move forward. If a community believes its evolution is complete simply because they have achieved human bodies and they just live to consume resources, sleep, and reproduce without any intellectual or moral assent, they are actively regressing.
They'd evolve back into the automated animalistic state of Jibilat.
Exactly.
They lose the divine energy of free will because they aren't exercising it to elevate society. They've just become very smart animals fighting over resources.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when the strong mistreat the weak, or when the wealthy hoard resources while the vulnerable perish, it isn't just a matter of bad morals or unethical behavior. It causes systemic structural collapse,
It breaks the machine.
treating humans like animals. meaning only giving them the bare minimum food and shelter to survive, but denying them intellectual development and equitable access to the society's resources guarantees that the community physically decays. They lose what the text calls waqar.
Let's define waqar. The conventional translation in most English Qurans is usually just respect or dignity, right?
Yes, but functionally in this framework, waqar denotes an advanced evolutionary state of civilizational dignity and structural stability. It is the state where the human condition is fortified against decay and the shocks of mortality.
So it's like a shield.
Right. When a society abandons mutual welfare, when it lets the vulnerable branches wither, it loses its waqar. The society brings about its own destruction. It creates an inevitable hell of social chaos, crime, revolution, and collapse.
Going back to our supercomputer analogy, you can't just pour water on a supercomputer and expect it to run. If you treat human free will with the exact same bare minimum maintenance you give a goat, just tossing it some food and letting it wander, the machine of society explodes.
It completely fails.
The blank slates of the next generation get filled with feral, destructive survivalist instincts. And eventually, those feral instincts tear down the institutions, the economy, and the civilization itself.
And that is why Parwez argues this text demands continuous empirical research and universal state-sponsored education. Because human beings must be actively taught how to exercise their free will constructively. Education and psychological nurturing are strict civilizational requirements, not optional luxuries for those who can afford it.
This interpretation completely reframes the entire purpose of religion in this context. It's not about retreating into a cave to pray or just making sure you recite the right words at a wedding.
Not at all.
It's about building an active, evolving, highly structured macroeconomic society that fiercely protects its weakest links. Because it understands that biologically, we are all the exact same organism.
It demands continuous societal ascension. The role of that divine energy, that free will, mandates that human knowledge and society must never remain stagnant. The text pushes humanity to continuously use its volition to ascend to higher levels of socioeconomic dignity and intellectual mastery. To fail to do so is to invite the law of requital.
Okay, let's take a breath and zoom out for a second. We've covered biochemistry, single-cell mitosis, evolutionary timelines, the psychology of free will, and the macroeconomic theory of wealth distribution.
It's a lot of ground.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We started this deep dive talking about how Surah An-Nisa is usually viewed as a dry list of domestic constraints. But the core permanent value, what Parwez calls the mustaqila qadar of this text, is something entirely different.
The mustaqila qadar established in this analysis is that human dignity and social equity are biologically hardwired into our origins. Because we share a single cellular root, an injury to the most vulnerable branch is literally an injury to the entire tree. Universal welfare is not just a political ideology, it is an evolutionary mandate.
It is a universal manifesto for human rights. It proves that taking care of the vulnerable isn't just charity or a nice thing to do on the weekends. It is the fundamental physics of keeping human civilization alive.
But this leaves us with a critical, glaring question. A cliffhanger, if you will.
Oh, I love a good cliffhanger.
We've seen how this incredible system protects the individual, and we've seen why hoarding resources destroys civilization through the law of requital. But how does the text actually define the authority?
Right. Who runs the tree? If human beings are fundamentally selfish blank slates, who can be trusted to gather the taxes and distribute the water to all the branches?
That is the ultimate political question. Who is the markaz, the central authority that must be trusted to enforce these human rights? How is it structured, and how does it avoid becoming a tyrannical dictatorship while ensuring equitable distribution?
That is exactly where we go in the next deep dive into Parwez's lectures. We will unpack the mechanics of the markaz. Until then, I want you to think back to the primordial mud. I want you to look at the people around you today, on your commute, in your office, on the news, even the people you completely disagree with politically.
It changes your perspective.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because if this text is right, and we all literally biologically splintered off from the exact same microscopic cell in a pool of fermented water millions of years ago, how much of what divides us right now is just an illusion?
It is a profound thought to sit with. We are, quite literally, one functional organism navigating the heavy burden of free will.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep pushing past the myths to find the mechanics, and we will see you next time.